Hi, friends. I'd like to talk to you about how labor gets started and what causes effacement, dilation, and change in station for our babies. Over the last 1,000 years or more of your matrilineal line, they have passed down to us the chemical signals for when we are going to mature our babies or how quickly we mature our babies. Ovens on high, in which case our babies are ready to be air breathers earlier in pregnancy, or are our ovens or our growth patterns on warm, in which case our babies might take longer to grow to term and or be ready to be air breathers. That matrilineal line then helps our babies know when they should release two proteins, SRC1 and SRC2. They send those chemical messengers to mom's brain and tells her to start to create oxytocin. Now, over the last month of pregnancy, we are laying down oxytocin receptor site. So you could imagine them to be, here's my lovely little uterus with our baby ping pong ball. And here's our cervix, which for most of us before we go into labor or birthing time is about 3 to 4 centimeters in length. Not true for everybody, but that's a pretty good average. And so over the last month of pregnancy, we start laying down these oxytocin receptor sites all over the uterus. And at first, we don't have very many of them. But as we get closer to our baby's birthday, we'll lay down more. And then our baby triggers with SRC1 and SRC2 our body to create oxytocin. So here's our red oxytocin. And now those click onto those receptor sites like the other half of a Lego. And that then triggers coordinated uterine contractions. Now, before that point, people may have been experiencing some practice contractions that are getting the uterus ready. We might call those Braxton Hicks, but really they're warming up. They're getting these uterine muscles and able to communicate in a coordinated way. If we've been pregnant before, then we may have more warm-ups. And people who are having their fourth, fifth baby, they have a lot of practice waves, even starting earlier. Maybe at 28 weeks or 30 weeks, they're starting to feel some contractions. And that's all healthy and normal, helping this uterine muscle get nice and strong. Now, the muscle itself is actually made of 3 different layers. And we have one layer that is latitudinal, like the equator. It goes across the uterus. This layer squeezes from side to side our baby's chest and body and begins to move this gel that's in their lungs. Right now, babies' lungs are collapsed and they are filled with this gel that keeps the alveoli soft and supple. And that surfactant is very thick mucus. And as we're having contractions, it begins to move that surfactant out of the baby's lungs, and then they start spitting it up. If people have their water broken or their water breaks at some point during birth, they might notice after an hour or two that it goes from very liquidy to more mucousy. And that's because it contains more of that surfactant. And if we have a very fast birth, our babies might not have gotten as much squeezing, in which case they may have more surfactant that they have to bring up on their own. And that's okay. They're made to do it. And so this layer squeezes our baby and gets them ready to be air breathers. And then we have a layer that is like a spiral. And this is the layer that rotates our baby through the uterus. So the baby needs to do what are called cardinal movements. They're now understanding that it's 4 cardinal movements for babies to move through the pelvis, from the inlet of the pelvis to the mid pelvis and outlet. We talk a lot about this in Spinning Babies. If you haven't taken a Spinning Babies workshop, please feel free to do that. I think is really informative. And then we have another layer that is up and down. And this layer is the one that pulls the cervix forward. Before we go into labor, our cervix is aimed way back. Let me see how I can show this. Way back towards our tailbone. And then as we start having birth waves, it starts tilting forward and then finally even aims out towards the front, towards the vaginal opening. And the other thing that this layer does is it starts to thin that cervix and then it starts to dilate. And it's in that order. So first the cervix gets pulled forward, then it thins, then it opens. And for first-time people, that's why early labor might take quite a long time. It's not unusual for that whole process to be 24 hours and still only be 1 centimeter. And that's because the cervix moved forward, then it began to thin, and then it starts to dilate. That's usually how that happens. Now, interestingly enough, there's one of these layers that stops contracting if people don't feel safe. So if we are in a place where we don't want to meet our baby, or if we don't feel comfortable with the people around us, then one layer will stop contracting. However, the other layers will keep doing their job. So it's not like people will feel like they're not having contractions, but one layer will stop. So if you have a guess, I invite you to enter it below or chat with your partner. Pause the video for just a second and decide together. Is it the yellow one that rotates? Is it the blue one that squeezes the baby? Is it the red one that pulls the cervix forward, effaces, and dilates? And I'll give you the answer now. It's the red one. So this is also why we might have a client, especially after the car ride, right? Our bodies know we don't want to have the baby in the car. And it's not unusual that people were rocking and rolling at home, working really hard. We get to the hospital, and then perhaps they have a vaginal exam or at the birth center, and maybe they're 5 centimeters. We might be in triage for another hour, 2, 3, 4, while they get a room ready, assign a nurse. And then when we get upstairs, we might find that we are still 5 centimeters. And the reason for that is because this layer paused in its function. Even though we kept having contractions, the other 2 layers kept doing their work. So if people have that exam, they might be really disappointed. Oh my gosh, 3 hours later, and I am still the same dilation. But I invite people to take heart because it turns out that this is often spring loaded. So even though we didn't see change happen, it pulled together that energy. And then once you feel like you're being treated like a goddess, once everyone is surrounding you with love, maybe that means that you're finally in your birth space. The lights are low. Our partner is only showering love on us. Maybe we add a door for more privacy. Maybe we can get into the bathroom or into the tub. We take a few moments, and then it isn't unusual to see somebody quickly go from 5 to 7 or something like that. Again, another reason to consider perhaps not finding out the number, because we might experience that, again, hearing that number could be disappointing. Someone makes the decision to have an epidural, and then after the epidural finds out that they're 7 centimeters. And people will say, oh, it's because the epidural helped you relax. That could be true, but more often it was actually that the body was just waiting until it was safe to do the change that it needed to. So I invite you to consider that. And then what happens for expulsion or pushing is that once we get to 10 centimeters, now this, the uterus and the cervix are all one muscle tissue. And once we get to 10 centimeters, this cervix is 100% thin and now dilated. But what needs to happen is those muscle fibers that make up the cervix, they actually get pulled up to the top of the uterus, which is called the fundus. And then they begin to wrap around the baby. So we might have space around the baby, in which case the uterus isn't very effectively pushing on the baby. It's just doing little squeezes, but the baby's not moving. And the fundus might not be where all the fibers are either. So this should be thin, wrapped around the baby, and the fundus should be thick. Once that happens, that's generally when people feel those spontaneous, powerful pushing urges. And that's where pushing is not something that you choose to do, but it's your body doing it on its own accord. Now, if we have pressure, that could be that the baby is low, but if we're not feeling that urge to push, we really want to wait for the uterus to do that wrapping and then moving that muscle bundle. And then each push is going to be so much more powerful and save time and energy. So I hope this was helpful, is a clarifying process of what happens. Now, in this exercise, people often also ask, where is the placenta? Now, the placenta, give me just a second, I should have had my prop ready. Our placenta attached in early pregnancy to part of the uterine wall. It is about the size of a dinner plate, and the placenta doesn't move. So wherever it attached to, it stays there on the inside of the uterus. I would put it inside the balloon if I could. And then, so it's unaffected by pushing. And then after the baby is out of the uterus, once we've met our baby, then the uterus can clamp down even more, and it essentially pushes off the placenta. It actually doesn't have space anymore, and the balloon kind of melts around it and pushes the placenta out. So I hope this was helpful, and follow along. Next step, we're going to talk about coping styles.